Joshua Slocum couldn't swim. It's almost impossible to believe, but the first man to sail solo around the world, the greatest single-handed sailor who ever lived, never learned to swim. He thought it was useless. If you fell overboard in the middle of the ocean, what good would swimming do? The sea would take you anyway. Perhaps that's why, on a November day in 1909, when Captain Slocum sailed away from Martha's Vineyard for what should have been a routine winter voyage, the ocean he loved so deeply finally claimed him. Joshua Slocum was born on February 20th, 1844, in a small farming community called Mount Hanley in Nova Scotia, Canada. He was the fifth of 11 children, growing up in a household where discipline came hard and dreams of escape came easy. His father, John Slocum, was a strict man who worked a rocky, unforgiving farm that barely fed the family. The boy, Joshua, would stand on the hills overlooking the Bay of Fundy, watching ships sail past, their white canvas wings carrying them to places he could only imagine. The sea called to him like a siren song, promising freedom from the grinding poverty and harsh winters of rural Nova Scotia. By the time he was 8 years old, Joshua was already trying to run away to sea. His father caught him each time, dragged him back, and put him to work harder on the farm. But you can't cage the wind, and you couldn't cage Joshua Slocum's spirit. The boy made boats from pieces of bark, sailed them in puddles and streams, and taught himself to read the weather by watching clouds gather over the bay. His mother, Sarah Jane Southern, saw the restlessness in her son's eyes. She knew, perhaps before Joshua himself did, that this child belonged to the ocean, not the land. At 14, Joshua finally succeeded in his escape. He signed on as a cook aboard a local fishing schooner, peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots while learning the ways of wind and sail. The work was brutal, the conditions harsh, but Joshua was finally where he belonged. From that schooner, he moved to larger vessels, working his way up from cook to ordinary seaman. He sailed on a ship bound for Dublin, and from there to Liverpool, where he joined the crew of the British merchant ship Tangier, heading for China. Can you imagine being 16 years old and sailing around Cape Horn for the first time? The Horn was a ship killer, a graveyard of vessels and dreams where waves tall as buildings crashed against rocky shores and winds howled like demons. Joshua rounded it twice before his 18th birthday. He saw Batavia, now Jakarta, touched at the Moluccas with their spice-scented air, walked the busy ports of Manila, Hong Kong, Saigon, and Singapore. While other young men his age were learning trades in workshops or studying in schools, Joshua was studying navigation by the stars, learning to read the moods of the ocean, and earning his education in the University of the Sea. The sea has its own kind of mathematics, its own poetry. Joshua discovered he had a natural gift for navigation, an almost mystical ability to know where he was on the vast, featureless ocean. While working as an ordinary seaman, he spent every free moment studying for the Board of Trade examination. At 18, just 18 years old, he received his certificate as a second mate. By the time he was 25, he had earned his captain's papers. This was remarkable for anyone, but for a farm boy from Nova Scotia with almost no formal education, it was extraordinary. In 1865, when San Francisco was still a gold rush boom town, full of fortune seekers and adventurers, Joshua Slocum arrived and decided to become an American citizen. The city suited him, rough around the edges, full of possibility, a place where a man's past mattered less than his ability. He tried his hand at salmon fishing in the Columbia River, even spent time hunting fur seals, but the sea kept calling him back. He couldn't stay on land for long. The solid ground felt wrong under his feet. He needed the constant motion of a deck, the rhythm of waves against a hull. His first command came in 1869, when he was just 25 years old, the bark Washington, which he sailed from San Francisco across the Pacific to Australia. Being a captain meant everything to Joshua. It wasn't just about authority or respect. It was about the profound relationship between a man, his ship, and the sea. A captain had to know every rope, every sail, every sound his vessel made in different conditions. He had to read the sky, feel changes in the wind before they happened, and sense danger in the subtle shift of currents. It was in Sydney, Australia, in 1871, that Joshua's life took an unexpected turn. He met Virginia Albertina Walker, an American woman with a spirit as adventurous as his own. Virginia wasn't like the other women of her time, who expected to stay safely on shore while their husbands sailed away. She loved the sea almost as much as Joshua did, and when he proposed to her, she said yes on one condition: she would sail with him. They married on January 31st, 1871, and Virginia became not just a captain's wife, but a true partner in his adventures. Their marriage was unlike anything conventional society expected. Virginia gave birth to 7 children, and here's the remarkable part: every single one was born at sea or in a foreign port. She would be in labor during storms, would nurse babies while the ship rolled in heavy seas, and taught her children their letters using charts and navigation books. The family's home wasn't a house with a white picket fence. It was whatever ship Joshua commanded, and their backyard was the entire ocean. Joshua commanded several ships during these years, each one larger and more prestigious than the last. There was the Constitution, the Benjamin Amar, and the Amethyst. But the ship that would define this period of his life was the Northern Light, a magnificent sailing vessel that he took command of in 1881. Under Joshua's command, the Northern Light became famous for its speed, once making the passage from New York to San Francisco in just 76 days, a remarkable achievement for the time. But the sea, which gives so generously, also takes without mercy. In 1884, while Joshua commanded the Aquidneck in Buenos Aires, Virginia fell ill. She had survived childbirth at sea, weathered countless storms, and faced down pirates, but this time the illness was beyond any medicine or care available. Virginia died in Buenos Aires, leaving Joshua devastated. She had been more than his wife. She had been his anchor, the one person who understood his need for the sea and shared it completely. For a man like Joshua, grief was something to be sailed through, not around. He continued working, continued sailing, but those who knew him said he was never quite the same after Virginia's death. He married again, to Henrietta Elliott in 1886, partly to provide a mother for his children. But Henrietta was different from Virginia. Where Virginia had embraced the sailing life, Henrietta merely endured it. She had experienced enough shipwrecks, storms, and pirate attacks to develop a deep dislike for the sea. The marriage was practical rather than passionate, an arrangement that solved problems but didn't heal wounds. Joshua's luck began to turn sour in the late 1880s. Ships he commanded were wrecked, business ventures failed, and he found himself at age 50 nearly broke and without prospects. The age of sail was ending, replaced by steam-powered vessels that didn't need the kind of skills Joshua had spent his life perfecting. Younger captains were getting the good commissions. Joshua Slocum, once one of the most respected captains sailing under the American flag, was becoming obsolete. It was at this low point, when most men would have given up, that fate intervened in the form of an old friend. Captain Eben Pierce, a retired whaler from New Bedford, had a proposition for Joshua. Pierce owned an ancient oyster sloop called the Spray that had been sitting in a field for years, slowly rotting away. "Come to Fairhaven," Pierce told Joshua, "and I'll give you a ship." When Joshua first saw the Spray, his heart must have sunk. The vessel was 36 feet, 9 inches long, built around 1800, and in terrible condition. Her timbers were rotten, her deck was full of holes, and she looked more like driftwood than a boat. But Joshua saw something in the old vessel that others didn't. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was the kind of vision that separates ordinary sailors from extraordinary ones. He accepted Pierce's gift and set to work. For 13 months, Joshua labored on the Spray. This wasn't just a repair job, it was a complete resurrection. He replaced the keel, the stem, the stern post. He put in new frames, new planking, a new deck. Working mostly alone, he drove in over 1,000 bolts, many of which he made himself. The total cost was $553.62, every penny carefully recorded in his meticulous notes. Neighbors would stop by to watch him work, some offering advice, many openly mocking his efforts. An old boat and an old sailor, they said, both past their prime, trying to recapture something that was already gone. But as the Spray took shape under Joshua's hands, something magical happened. The boat that emerged from his labor wasn't just seaworthy, she was special. The Spray had perfect balance, an almost supernatural ability to hold her course without anyone at the helm. Joshua discovered this by accident during sea trials. He would lash the wheel, adjust the sails, and the Spray would sail herself for hours, even days, keeping perfectly on course. In an age before autopilots or self-steering gear, this was an extraordinary characteristic. As Joshua worked on the Spray, an idea began to form in his mind. It started as a whisper, grew to a thought, and finally became an obsession. What if he could do something that had never been done before? What if he could sail around the world alone, in this little boat that everyone said was worthless? The idea was audacious, even crazy. In 1895, no one had ever sailed single-handed around the world. Many believed it was impossible. The physical demands, the navigation challenges, the sheer psychological strain of being alone at sea for months. Surely no single person could manage it all. But Joshua Slocum had been preparing for this his entire life. Even if he didn't know it, every skill he'd learned, every storm he'd survived, every mile he'd sailed had been leading to this moment. He didn't have money. He had $1.50 in his pocket when he made his decision. He didn't have sponsors or support. His chronometer, essential for navigation, was a cheap tin clock that barely worked. But he had the Spray, he had 40 years of experience at sea, and he had a burning need to prove that he wasn't finished, that the age of sailing adventures wasn't over. On April 24th, 1895, at noon, Joshua Slocum raised the Spray's sails in Boston Harbor. He later wrote about this moment with typical understated poetry. The 12 o'clock whistles were blowing just as the sloop shot ahead under full sail. A short board was made up the harbor on the port tack. Then coming about, she stood to seaward, with her boom well off to port, and swung past the ferries with lively heels. A photographer on the outer pier of East Boston got a picture of her as she swept by, her flag at the peak throwing her folds clear. A thrilling pulse beat high in me. My step was light on deck in the crisp air. I felt there could be no turning back, and that I was engaging in an adventure the meaning of which I thoroughly understood. Think about that moment. A 51-year-old man, virtually penniless, sailing away from everything familiar on a quest that everyone said would kill him. The Boston newspapers barely mentioned his departure. Those that did treated it as a curiosity, the foolish adventure of an old salt who didn't know when to quit. Even Joshua's friends didn't expect to see him again. The ocean was too vast, the challenge too great, the margin for error too small. But Joshua had calculated everything with the precision of a master navigator. He knew his first challenge would be crossing the Atlantic, a 3,000-mile passage that would test both him and the Spray. Before attempting the crossing, though, he sailed north to his childhood home in Nova Scotia. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a chance to say goodbye to the places that had shaped him. He visited Briar Island, walked the shores he'd known as a boy, and perhaps made peace with the ghost of that young Joshua who had dreamed of adventure while watching ships sail past. On July 3rd, 1895, Joshua departed North America for real, setting out from Nova Scotia into the vast Atlantic. His plan was to sail east to Gibraltar, then through the Mediterranean Sea and the Suez Canal, following the trade routes to the Pacific. It was the logical route, the one that made the most sense. But the sea had other plans for Joshua Slocum. The Atlantic crossing took 29 days. 29 days alone, with only the wind and waves for company. Most people can't imagine that kind of solitude. No radio, no way to call for help, no one to talk to except the spray herself. Joshua developed routines to keep himself sane. He would cook elaborate meals, read books he'd brought along, and talk to the boat as if she were alive. And in a way, she was alive. The spray had moods, preferences, ways of telling Joshua when something was wrong. He learned to interpret every creak, every change in her motion, every subtle shift in how she handled. When Joshua reached Gibraltar, his planned route fell apart. Pirates, Barbary pirates operating out of Morocco, were attacking small vessels. Joshua had several close encounters, once being chased by pirates who would have certainly killed him if they'd caught the spray. One night, he was pursued so closely that he could hear the pirates shouting. He used every trick he knew, sailing into waters too shallow for the pirate vessels, using the spray's superior sailing ability to outmaneuver them. But it was clear that continuing through the Mediterranean would be suicide. So Joshua Slocum did what great adventurers do. He adapted. He turned the spray around and headed back across the Atlantic, this time to Brazil. Think about that decision. He had just spent a month crossing the Atlantic, and now he would cross it again, adding thousands of miles to an already impossible journey. Most people would have given up, called it a failed attempt, gone home. But Joshua wasn't most people. The second Atlantic crossing brought its own challenges. Off the coast of Brazil, Joshua encountered weather that tested every bit of his seamanship. But Brazil also brought unexpected joy. In Rio de Janeiro, he was welcomed as a celebrity. Word of his attempt had spread, and the Brazilians, always lovers of adventure, embraced him. He was invited to dinners, given supplies, treated like the hero he was becoming. It must have been strange for Joshua, going from complete solitude at sea to being the center of attention in port. From Brazil, Joshua headed south toward one of the most dangerous passages in the world, the Strait of Magellan. The strait, cutting through the southern tip of South America, was a ship's graveyard. Vicious currents, hidden rocks, sudden storms that came out of nowhere, and worse, the Fuegian Indians who inhabited the region were known to attack vulnerable vessels. Joshua entered the strait in February 1896, the height of the Southern Hemisphere summer, but even in summer, the weather was brutal. He was immediately hit by a storm so violent that he had to find shelter in a small cove. For 4 days, the wind howled at hurricane force. The spray dragged her anchor, threatening to be thrown onto the rocks. Joshua spent those days in constant vigilance, adjusting anchors, watching for changes in wind direction, praying the storm would break before his strength gave out. When the weather finally calmed, Joshua faced a new threat. The Fuegians had a reputation for sneaking aboard anchored vessels at night, killing the crew and stealing everything of value. Joshua was alone, vulnerable, an easy target. He came up with an ingenious defense: carpet tacks. Each night before going to sleep, he would spread carpet tacks across the spray's deck. It sounds almost comical, but it worked. One night, he woke to the sound of screaming. Fuegians had crept aboard in the darkness, only to step on the tacks with their bare feet. They fled, and word must have spread because Joshua wasn't bothered again. The passage through the strait took over 2 months. 2 months of constant danger and exhaustion. At one point, a massive wave, Joshua estimated it at 40 feet, struck the spray. The boat was thrown on her beam ends, nearly capsizing. Water flooded the cabin. For a moment, Joshua thought it was over, that the sea had finally won. But the spray righted herself, shook off the water like a dog, and sailed on. That was the miracle of the boat. She was almost impossible to sink, to make the Fuegians think he had a crew. Joshua would go below deck through one hatch, change clothes, and emerge from another, creating the illusion of multiple people aboard. He would shout orders to imaginary crew members, hang different clothes on the rigging, anything to maintain the deception. Imagine the psychological strain. Not only was he alone, but he had to constantly pretend he wasn't. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, Joshua emerged from the western end of the strait into the Pacific Ocean. But the Pacific, despite its name, was anything but peaceful. He was immediately hit by another storm, this one so severe that it drove him back toward the strait. For days he fought to make progress westward, only to be pushed back each time. It was like the ocean was testing him, seeing if he had the will to continue. Joshua's log from this period reveals his state of mind. I had been in storms before, but this was something new. The waves weren't just big. They were malevolent, seeming to attack the spray from every direction. I lashed myself to the mast to avoid being washed overboard and let the boat find her own way through the chaos. This is the key to understanding Joshua's success. He trusted the spray completely. Where other sailors would have tried to fight the storm, Joshua worked with it, letting the boat's natural stability keep them safe. After finally breaking free of the storm, Joshua set course for the Juan Fernandez Islands, specifically Robinson Crusoe Island. He needed rest, repairs, and supplies. The island's inhabitants welcomed him warmly, fascinated by his story. Children would gather around as he told tales of his adventures. Adults brought him food, helped repair the spray's sails, and refused any payment. There was something about Joshua that inspired generosity in people. Maybe it was his quiet courage, or maybe people recognized they were witnessing history in the making. From Juan Fernandez, Joshua faced the longest single passage of his voyage, the crossing of the Pacific Ocean to Samoa. Over 6,000 miles of open water. For 72 days he saw no land, no other ships, nothing but water and sky. 72 days alone with his thoughts, his memories, and the constant work of sailing. He would later write that during this passage he experienced a kind of transcendence, a feeling of being one with the ocean, the boat, and the universe itself. The spray sailed herself for most of this passage. Joshua would set the sails, lash the helm, and the boat would maintain her course for days at a time. He once sailed 2,000 miles without touching the helm even once. This gave him time to read, to write in his journal, to maintain the boat, and simply to think. He read everything from Shakespeare to books on navigation, from adventure stories to philosophical works. The spray's cabin became a floating library, a sanctuary of human thought in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Navigation was a constant challenge. Without a proper chronometer, Joshua couldn't determine longitude precisely. He relied on dead reckoning, estimating his position based on speed, direction, and time elapsed. It required incredible skill and intuition. On one occasion, to check his navigation, he took a lunar observation, using the position of the moon relative to stars to determine longitude. This was a technique that had been largely abandoned for decades, considered too difficult and unreliable. But Joshua made it work, confirming that his dead reckoning had been remarkably accurate. When Joshua finally sighted Samoa, he had been at sea for so long that walking on land felt strange. The solid ground seemed to move under his feet. In Samoa, he met the widow of Robert Louis Stevenson, the famous author who had died there just a few years earlier. Mrs. Stevenson was fascinated by Joshua's journey and invited him to stay at their estate. She showed him Stevenson's grave, and Joshua, always the romantic, left a small tribute to the author, whose adventure stories had helped pass the long hours at sea. From Samoa, Joshua sailed to Australia, arriving in Sydney like a conquering hero. The Australians, perhaps more than any other nation, understood what he was attempting. They were a maritime people, surrounded by ocean, and they recognized the magnitude of his achievement. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the American captain, though Canadian-born, who was sailing alone around the world. He was invited to give lectures, to attend dinners, to meet with sailing clubs. The attention was overwhelming for a man who had just spent months in solitude. But Joshua was also running out of money. The lectures helped. Australians packed halls to hear him speak, but he needed supplies for the rest of the journey. In a stroke of luck, or perhaps recognition of his achievement, suppliers began offering him goods for free. Sailmakers repaired his sails, rope manufacturers gave him new lines, food suppliers stocked his galley. It was as if the entire country had adopted him and the Spray. In Melbourne, something extraordinary happened. Joshua was giving a lecture when a man in the audience stood up and challenged him. The man claimed it was impossible for one person to sail a boat continuously for days without rest. How could Joshua sleep? How could he navigate? It must be a hoax. Joshua's response was simple and brilliant. He invited the man, and anyone else who doubted, to inspect the Spray. He demonstrated how the boat could sail herself, how he had arranged the cabin for maximum efficiency, how every detail had been thought through. The doubters left as believers. From Australia, Joshua sailed north through the Torres Strait, then across the Indian Ocean. This passage included some of the most beautiful sailing of the entire voyage. Day after day of perfect weather, steady winds, calm seas. The Spray seemed to fly across the water, covering 150 miles a day, without Joshua having to adjust anything. He would later describe this as the closest thing to perfect sailing he had ever experienced. But the Indian Ocean also held dangers. Pirates operated out of various islands, and a lone sailor was an easy target. Joshua avoided the main shipping lanes, sailing far from the usual routes. He kept weapons ready, an old rifle and a revolver, though he hoped never to use them. Once he was approached by a suspicious vessel, but the Spray's speed allowed him to outrun it. These moments of danger were reminders that despite the beauty and romance of the voyage, death was always just one mistake away. Rounding the Cape of Good Hope was another major milestone. The Cape, where the Indian and Atlantic Oceans meet, was notorious for its storms and rough seas. Ships regularly foundered there, earning it the nickname Cape of Storms. But Joshua had timed his arrival perfectly, catching the Cape in one of its calmer moods. As he rounded Africa's southern tip, he must have felt the journey entering its final phase. The hardest passages were behind him. Ahead lay the familiar waters of the Atlantic. In South Africa, Joshua was again treated as a celebrity. The British colonial authorities, initially suspicious of this lone American sailor, soon warmed to him. He was invited to meet with government officials, to speak at the Royal Naval Club, to attend society functions. But what touched Joshua most were the ordinary people, the dock workers who refused payment for helping him, the children who gathered to see the famous Spray, the old sailors who understood what he had achieved. The final Atlantic crossing was perhaps the most emotional part of the journey. Joshua was sailing toward home, but what was home now? He had been gone for over 3 years. The world had changed. Technology was advancing rapidly. Automobiles were becoming common. The Spanish-American War had begun, and the age of sail that Joshua represented was ending. He was returning as a hero, but a hero from another era. As he sailed north through the Atlantic, Joshua faced one more significant challenge: the Caribbean. He had no charts for these waters, navigating by instinct and asking local fishermen for directions. It seems almost absurd that after navigating around the entire world, he would be sailing blind in waters so close to home. But that was Joshua, adaptable, resourceful, never letting obstacles stop him. On June 27, 1898, at 1 o'clock in the morning, Joshua Slocum sailed into Newport, Rhode Island. He had been gone 3 years, 2 months, and 2 days. He had sailed 46,000 miles alone in a boat that everyone said would sink. He had proven that one person, with skill, courage, and determination, could circle the globe under sail. It was one of the greatest maritime achievements in history. But here's the heartbreaking part: almost nobody noticed. The Spanish-American War dominated the headlines. Joshua's arrival was mentioned in a few newspapers, but it was overshadowed by war news. He tied the Spray to a mooring and went to sleep, the first sleep in a safe harbor in over 3 years. When he woke, there were no crowds, no fanfare, just the quiet lapping of water against the hull. Gradually, word spread about what Joshua had accomplished. Newspapers began to run stories. people began to understand the magnitude of his achievement. He was invited to meet President Theodore Roosevelt, who became a friend and admirer. Publishers wanted his story. Joshua, who had kept detailed notes throughout the voyage, began writing what would become Sailing Alone Around the World. The book, published in 1899, was an immediate success. It wasn't just an adventure story. It was literature. Joshua wrote with humor, poetry, and profound insight about the sea, solitude, and the human spirit. The book made him famous worldwide and provided him with income he had never known as a working captain. It's still in print today, over 120 years later, still inspiring sailors and dreamers. But fame couldn't fill the void in Joshua's life. He was a man of the sea, not a celebrity. He tried to settle down with Henrietta in Martha's Vineyard, but the land felt like a prison. He would spend hours on the Spray, maintaining her, making small improvements, planning new voyages. Henrietta wanted him to sell the boat, to finally give up the sea, but Joshua couldn't. The Spray wasn't just a boat. She was part of him, the companion who had shared the greatest adventure of his life. Joshua began making winter voyages to the Caribbean, partly for income from lectures, partly to escape the cold New England winters, but mostly because he needed to sail. These weren't grand adventures like the circumnavigation, just an old sailor and his boat, wandering the warm waters, visiting islands, telling his story to anyone who would listen. But even these simple voyages were becoming harder. Joshua was aging, the Spray was aging, and the world was moving on. By 1909, Joshua was 65 years old. The Spray had been his home for nearly 20 years, but she was showing her age. People who saw her in her final days said she looked tired, worn, her seams working in any sea. Joshua himself was struggling financially. Book sales had slowed, lecture opportunities were fewer, and maintaining the Spray was expensive. But he had one more adventure planned. He told friends, including President Roosevelt, that he wanted to explore the Orinoco River in Venezuela, to sail into the heart of South America via the Amazon. It was an ambitious plan for a younger man with a newer boat. For a 65-year-old in a vessel held together by constant maintenance and willpower, it was almost impossible. But that had never stopped Joshua before. On November 14, 1909, Joshua Slocum sailed the Spray out of Vineyard Haven, Massachusetts. It was a gray day, cold with winter coming on. A few people saw him leave, noted that the Spray looked low in the water, perhaps overloaded with supplies for the long voyage. Joshua waved, called out a farewell, and sailed into the mist. He was never seen again. At first, nobody worried. Joshua often disappeared for months at a time, but by the spring of 1910, concern was growing. He should have reached the Caribbean by then, should have sent word. Henrietta contacted authorities, inquired at ports throughout the West Indies. Nothing. No one had seen the Spray or her captain. In July 1910, Henrietta told newspapers she believed her husband was lost at sea. The search for Joshua Slocum became one of the great maritime mysteries. There were alleged sightings. Someone claimed to have seen him in Miami, another in the Bahamas, but none were confirmed. Theories proliferated about what had happened. Had the Spray finally succumbed to age and rot, opening her seams in heavy weather? Had Joshua, who famously couldn't swim, fallen overboard? Had he been run down by a steamer in the night, the crew never even knowing they had killed the world's most famous sailor? Some people believed Joshua had deliberately disappeared, unable to face the decline of old age and poverty. They pointed to his unhappy marriage, his financial struggles, his depression at seeing the age of sail ending. Perhaps he had sailed to some remote island to live out his days in peace. It was a romantic notion, but those who knew Joshua best dismissed it. He loved his children too much to simply abandon them, and he was too honest to stage his own disappearance. The most likely explanation is also the simplest and saddest. The Spray, after 20 years of hard sailing, finally failed. Perhaps her seams opened in a storm. Perhaps she struck a reef or floating debris. Perhaps she was indeed struck by a larger vessel. Joshua, who had always said that learning to swim was pointless for a sailor, would have gone down with his beloved boat. They had sailed around the world together. It was fitting in a tragic way that they would leave it together. There's something particularly haunting about Joshua's disappearance in what we now call the Bermuda Triangle. This area, known for mysterious disappearances of ships and aircraft, seems to have claimed the greatest sailor of his generation. Over 1,000 vessels have reportedly vanished in these waters over the past century. Was Joshua's disappearance connected to whatever strange forces operate there, or was it simply coincidence that he vanished in waters already notorious for swallowing ships? In 1924, 15 years after his disappearance, Joshua Slocum was officially declared dead. The legal date of death was listed as November 14, 1909, the day he sailed from Vineyard Haven. But for those who love the sea and sailing, Joshua Slocum never really died. He became something more than a man. He became a legend, a symbol of what one person with courage and skill could accomplish. Today, over a century after his disappearance, Joshua Slocum's influence is everywhere in the sailing world. Every person who sails alone, every yacht designed for single-handed sailing, every adventure that seems impossible owes something to the captain of the Spray. His book remains required reading for sailors. His route around the world has been followed by hundreds of other solo sailors, all trying to capture something of his spirit. There's a monument to Joshua in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, where he rebuilt the Spray. It faces out to sea, toward the horizon he spent his life chasing. Sailors still stop there to pay their respects, to touch the monument for luck before their own voyages. In Nova Scotia, where he was born, there are plaques and memorials to their famous son who conquered the oceans. But Joshua's real monument isn't made of stone, it's made of water and wind, of every mile sailed by those he inspired. What makes Joshua's story so compelling isn't just what he achieved, but how he achieved it. In an age of increasing technology and complexity, he proved that simplicity, skill, and courage were enough. He didn't have GPS, satellite communications, or modern weather forecasting. He had a compass, a sextant, dead reckoning, and an intimate knowledge of the sea. He proved that humans could still achieve the impossible through determination and expertise. The relationship between Joshua and the Spray was something beyond normal understanding. Sailors often speak of their boats as living things, but for Joshua, the Spray truly was alive. She was his companion, his protector, his home. He knew every sound she made, every motion, every mood. When she sailed herself across thousands of miles of ocean, it wasn't just her design, it was the perfect harmony between boat and sailor, a partnership that transcended the mechanical. Joshua's writings reveal a deep philosopher hidden beneath the practical sailor. He wrote about solitude, not as loneliness but as freedom. He described the ocean not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a teacher to be respected. His observations about different cultures he encountered showed a man free of the prejudices of his time, someone who judged people by their actions, not their origins. In many ways, he was decades ahead of his time in his thinking. The tragedy of Joshua Slocum isn't just that he disappeared, it's that he disappeared at a moment when the world was finally ready to fully appreciate what he had done. The early 20th century saw an explosion of interest in exploration and adventure. Joshua could have been a celebrity lecturer, a best-selling author, an elder statesman of sailing. Instead, he vanished just as his greatest recognition was beginning, but perhaps that's fitting. Joshua Slocum was never comfortable with fame. He was happiest alone on the Spray, sailing through a calm night with the stars reflecting on the water. The idea of growing old on land, giving the same lectures over and over, watching the spray rot at a dock, that would have been a different kind of death for him. By disappearing into the sea he loved, he became eternal, forever sailing just beyond the horizon. The mystery of his disappearance adds something profound to his story. We know how he lived, but not how he died. We know his triumphs, but not his final moments. This uncertainty keeps him alive in our imagination. Every sailor who goes missing at sea evokes his memory. Every unexplained disappearance in the Bermuda Triangle recalls his fate. He has become part of maritime mythology, a ghost captain sailing forever through our collective consciousness. Think about what Joshua Slocum represented. He was a working-class man who achieved something extraordinary through skill and determination. He didn't come from wealth or privilege. He didn't have corporate sponsors or government support. He had a dream, the skills to pursue it, and the courage to risk everything. In an age when we're told that great achievements require teams, technology, and massive resources, Joshua's story reminds us that individuals can still change the world. The technical achievement of his circumnavigation cannot be overstated. Modern solo sailors, with all their technology, still struggle with the challenges Joshua faced. The psychological burden of months alone at sea breaks many who attempt it. The physical demands of handling a sailing vessel, single-handed in all weather conditions, are extreme. The navigation challenges, even with modern instruments, are daunting. Joshua managed all of this with 19th century technology and a boat that was already old when he rebuilt her. But beyond the technical achievement was something deeper. Joshua proved that adventure wasn't dead, that there were still frontiers to explore, still impossible things to make possible. At a time when the world was becoming smaller, more mapped, more known, he showed that individual courage could still write new chapters in human achievement. He inspired generations of adventurers, not just sailors, but anyone who dreamed of doing something extraordinary. The influence of sailing alone around the world on literature cannot be ignored. It essentially created a new genre, the single-handed sailing narrative. Every book about solo sailing since then owes something to Joshua's work. His writing style, clear, honest, touched with humor and poetry, showed that adventure writing could be literature. He didn't just describe what happened. He explored what it meant, what it felt like, what it revealed about being human. Joshua's disappearance in 1909 came at a pivotal moment in maritime history. The age of commercial sail was ending. Steam had won. The skills Joshua had spent his life perfecting were becoming obsolete. Young men no longer went to sea to learn navigation by the stars. They went to engineering schools to learn about engines. The romance of sail was giving way to the efficiency of steam. Joshua represented the end of an era, and his disappearance seemed to symbolize the passing of that age. Yet, in another sense, Joshua was ahead of his time. The kind of sailing he pioneered, small boat, single-handed for adventure rather than commerce, would become increasingly popular throughout the 20th century. Today, thousands of people sail small boats across oceans, following routes Joshua pioneered. The equipment is better. The boats are faster, but the essential challenge remains the same: one person, one boat, against the sea. The Spray herself became a legend. Her lines have been studied and reproduced countless times. Naval architects still argue about what made her so special, why she could sail herself when most boats cannot. Some say it was her long keel, others her sail plan. Still others some indefinable quality that can't be reproduced. Dozens of replicas have been built, but none have quite matched the original's abilities. Perhaps it wasn't just the boat. Perhaps it was the combination of the boat and the man who sailed her. Joshua's story resonates because it's about more than sailing. It's about refusing to accept limitations, about pursuing dreams that others say are impossible, about finding meaning in challenge and solitude. It's about the relationship between humans and nature, about respect for the sea, about the courage to be alone with yourself for months at a time. These themes are universal, timeless, as relevant today as they were in 1895. The fact that Joshua couldn't swim adds a layer of complexity to his story. Many sailors of his generation shared this inability, believing that if you went overboard in the middle of the ocean, swimming would only prolong the inevitable. But for Joshua, it meant that every moment on the Spray carried the risk of instant death. One slip, one rogue wave, one moment of inattention, and it would be over. He lived with this knowledge every day for 3 years during his circumnavigation, and for all the years after. His relationship with his wives reveals another dimension of his character. With Virginia, he found a true partner who shared his love of the sea. Her death broke something in him that never fully healed. With Henrietta, he tried to recapture that partnership, but found only incompatibility. She wanted security, stability, a normal life. He wanted the freedom of the sea, the challenge of the horizon. Their marriage was a tragedy of mismatched dreams. Two good people who wanted fundamentally different things from life. The financial struggles of Joshua's later years add pathos to his story. Here was a man who had achieved something magnificent, written a best-selling book, become world-famous, yet he died poor and probably alone. The capitalist system that celebrated achievement couldn't sustain the achiever. He gave lectures to make ends meet, sold souvenirs from his voyage, did whatever he could to keep the spray afloat and supplied. The man who had sailed around the world couldn't navigate the economic challenges of life on land. President Theodore Roosevelt's friendship with Joshua was one of the bright spots in his later years. Roosevelt, himself an adventurer and lover of the outdoors, recognized a kindred spirit in the old sailor. They corresponded, met when Joshua was in Washington, shared stories of adventure. Roosevelt understood what Joshua had achieved in a way that few others could. When Joshua disappeared, Roosevelt was genuinely grieved, losing not just a friend, but a link to a more adventurous age. The children Joshua left behind carried on his legacy in various ways. Some went to sea, following in their father's wake. Others chose different paths, but carried with them the lessons learned from a childhood spent on sailing ships. They had seen the world, experienced cultures most children only read about, learned that boundaries and limitations were often just suggestions. Joshua gave them a unique education, one that no school could provide. As the years passed after Joshua's disappearance, sightings were reported from around the world. Someone saw an old man and a small sloop in the Solomon Islands. Another spotted the spray in a remote Caribbean anchorage. These sightings were never confirmed, but they kept the legend alive. People wanted to believe that Joshua had found some perfect island, some sailor's paradise where he could live out his days in peace. It was easier than accepting that the sea had finally claimed him. The development of modern sailing technology makes Joshua's achievement even more impressive in retrospect. Today's solo sailors have GPS that tells them their position within feet. They have radar that sees through fog and darkness. They have weather satellites that warn of storms days in advance. They have emergency beacons that can summon help from anywhere in the world. They have boats built with space-age materials that are stronger, lighter, and faster than anything Joshua could have imagined. Yet with all these advantages, many still fail where Joshua succeeded. What did Joshua think about in those long nights alone at sea? With no radio, no music, no entertainment except books and his own thoughts, how did he maintain his sanity? His writings give us glimpses. He thought about his dead wife Virginia, about his children, about the meaning of life and death. He found comfort in the stars, navigation aids that were also companions in the darkness. He developed a relationship with the ocean that was almost mystical, learning to read its moods and intentions like an old friend. The physical toll of single-handed sailing is extreme. Joshua had to be on constant alert for changes in weather, for other ships, for equipment failures. He could never sleep deeply, always maintaining a part of his consciousness that monitored the boat's motion and sounds. He had to handle sails in all weather conditions, make repairs at sea, navigate while exhausted. By the time he completed his circumnavigation, he had aged visibly. The sea had marked him, claimed part of him as its price for allowing the voyage. The spray's ability to self-steer wasn't just a mechanical quirk. It was what made the voyage possible. Without it, Joshua would have had to hand steer constantly, making sleep impossible and the voyage suicidal. This characteristic, discovered almost by accident, was the key to everything. It allowed him to navigate, to eat, to rest, to maintain the boat, to stay sane. The Spray wasn't just a good boat. She was the perfect boat for this specific challenge. Joshua's navigation methods were a masterclass in traditional seamanship. Dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed, direction, and time, requires not just mathematical skill, but intuition, a feel for the subtle factors that affect a boat's progress. Current leeway, variations in speed, the effect of waves, all had to be factored in without instruments to measure them precisely. That Joshua could navigate accurately across thousands of miles of open ocean using these methods is almost miraculous. The different receptions Joshua received in various ports revealed the diversity of the world in the 1890s. In some places, he was treated as a hero, in others with suspicion. Some officials couldn't believe one man could sail such distances alone. Others embraced him immediately, recognizing the magnitude of his achievement. These encounters gave Joshua a unique perspective on humanity, showing him both the best and worst of human nature. The literary quality of Joshua's writing sets him apart from many adventurers. He didn't just record events. He crafted narrative, built suspense, developed themes. His descriptions of storms are terrifying, his observations of calm seas poetic, his encounters with people warm and humorous. He had the gift of making readers feel they were there with him on the Spray, sharing the danger and beauty of the voyage. This literary skill ensured his story would endure long after other adventures were forgotten. Joshua's attitude toward indigenous peoples was remarkably progressive for his time. While he took precautions against the Fuegians, who had a reputation for violence, he didn't demonize them. He understood they were protecting their territory from invaders. In other encounters with native peoples, he showed respect and curiosity, rather than the superiority common among Westerners of his era. He judged individuals by their actions, not their race or culture. The question of what happened to the Spray is as mysterious as what happened to Joshua. No wreckage was ever definitively identified. The boat simply vanished, taking her secrets with her. Did she break up in a storm? Did she hit a reef? Was she run down by a steamer? Without the wreck, we'll never know. The Spray exists now only in photographs, drawings, and the memories of those who saw her. Like Joshua himself, she passed from reality into legend, without a clear ending. Joshua's influence on yacht design was profound. The Spray's characteristics, her stability, her self-steering ability, her seaworthiness became goals for yacht designers. The concept of a boat that could be sailed single-handed safely across oceans drove innovations in rigging, hull design, and equipment. Every modern blue water cruising yacht owes something to the lessons learned from the Spray. The psychological aspects of Joshua's voyage pioneered our understanding of long-term solitude. He was one of the first people to write extensively about the mental challenges of being alone for months. His strategies for maintaining sanity, routine, purposeful activity, acceptance of solitude rather than fighting it, are now standard advice for solo sailors. He showed that humans could endure extreme isolation if they had purpose and the right mental framework. Joshua's story intersects with the larger narrative of American maritime history. He represented the best of American seamanship at a time when the United States was emerging as a global power. His achievement brought pride to a nation that was looking for heroes, for evidence of American capability and courage. Though Canadian by birth, Joshua had chosen to become American, and America claimed him as its own.